Welcome to ORdio. We're the podcast of OR Books. I'm here with Robin Andersen, who's our newest author. Robin is a professor emerita of media studies at Fordham and the author of The Complicit Lens, U.S. media coverage of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Thank you so much for being here, Robin.
Thank you for inviting me, Anna.
To start, can you tell me about the process of putting together this book? How did it come around? What made you want to write a book about this?
Oh, well, I've written about war and media, woven in or out of my whole career. So I was writing for Project Censored to their annual book, and when October 7th happened, they said, Robin, why don't you write about this? So that piece, that was the first piece. It was right after it started, and many of us began to realize that this was going to be some pretty bad media coverage. You know, we've looked at not only the censorship on media, but the way that media distorts and misinterprets events. So that piece went all around, and by that time I was writing about it, and it just kind of came naturally to work it into a book.
The book is a really almost exhaustive account of U.S. and Western media portrayals and the language used and interactions with Palestinian journalists during the genocide. How do you go about compiling this kind of archive of so many thousands and thousands of examples?
Right. Well, that's a process of selection. There are many methodologies for doing media studies, and I think they're all represented pretty much in the book. One obvious way was to do it by theme and by different events, but another way is that there's content analysis in there, so there's that kind of study. So I also looked at the content analysis. I looked at the editorial directives to the journalists. Media studies, we always compare what we see on screen and in the pages of the press to the First Amendment and the kind of standards of journalism, of fairness and accuracy. And we began to notice early on that this was a very pro-Israel media frame. There's also other ways in which media frames are constructed. The book basically contrasts the incredible documentation done by the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, and it contrasts it to the constructed media frames of legacy and establishment media. So themes come into the established media. There are themes of everything that starts with violence, themes that pull out of the cultural atmosphere, stereotypes of the knife-wielding Arab, other kinds of stereotypes when people are in humanitarian emergencies. This thing called lawlessness emerges. So there's then that. What I do to the constructed lens then is I also compare it to what mainstream media was not reporting on and all of the sources that alternative and independent media were reporting on. So they were reporting from the human rights perspective. They were reporting what the aid monitors were finding, and also the rules of international war, which for the most part, overall, legacy media just ignored that Israel was actually committing war crimes right from the start. You've got to remember that 25 days into this genocide, 5,000 Palestinians had been killed.
Can you tell me about the choice to call it the complicit lens? There's obviously been so much talk about how Western media was helping to manufacture this genocide. Why complicit?
Well, you have to have a language to start a genocide. Genocides don't start without incitement. And there are a number of categories that have been defined as crimes of war, as incitement to genocide. So when you have elected officials or government officials, military officials, and they are saying really dehumanized and false claims over mainstream media at a time of great tension, that is how the UN and that is how we define incitement to genocide. So since you really can't do genocide without that, that's always a component of genocide globally, they're complicit in it. They're part of it. Just like the United States was supplying weapons constantly, even though they officially claimed they wanted a ceasefire. But of course they weren't calling for a ceasefire and then giving them $4 or $5 billion more dollars that's not very much incentive for a ceasefire.
Yeah. Through this book, it's a history or kind of a tracking of media portrayal of the war and the genocide. And through the media, it becomes also a kind of history of the genocide itself. It seems that this war in particular is like indetachable from media portrayal. Is that unique to this war, or is that something that is always a part of war?
Well, the media coverage of war has always been problematic. It's just different. Its trajectory through time and through different wars is quite different. You've always got to have the demonization of the enemy. And Palestinians were demonized to the maximum. And you had the Israeli officials also, calling Palestinians animals, saying things like, when Hamas attacked us, the Palestinians should have been appalled. Instead, they celebrated. So they're animals, and now we will do whatever we want to them. We will stop the water. We'll stop the housing. It'll be a tent city. They won't have any food. There will be nothing there. So that every part of that statement is a threat to genocide. You're doing disproportionate violence. Of course, destroying the Gaza Strip because supposedly 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, were killed by Hamas, but of course they weren't because Israel killed many Israeli civilians as well. So supposedly, even that number, by the time you get even 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Palestinians killed, you're talking about something that's disproportionately violent and it's making civilians pay for what your leaders or your resistance fighters did. And all of that is ways in which we have to kind of decode media and kind of unpack it and say what they're saying and what they did wrong.
I remember reading about some of those instances of calling Palestinians animals from the West, and they would describe it also as isolated incidents. When you really think of it in the totality of this, it's this mass narrative that is being produced from the Israeli government. It's a collection of isolated incidents that together are not isolated at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so starting that story, that official Israeli narrative, everything started on October 7th,
right,
takes it out of its historical flow, right, and everything that happened before that, and it's happened after that now. We can see what they're doing, and it becomes very obvious in hindsight. But before, Palestinian civil society had basically tried every nonviolent thing. They had their allies at the UN. And everything that they tried, the US and the Israelis together would vote against at the UN. They'd had the BDS movement. Israel identified that as terrorist diplomacy. So all you have to do is say somebody's a terrorist or that it's terroristic, and then you just wipe it out and discount it. And you can't really do that. Israel couldn't have done that. Sure, Israel, they lie. U.S. government lies. All officials lie. The military lies. It's up to journalists to unpack those lies and to tell that they're supposed to be working for us in a democracy. They're supposed to call out our representatives when they lie. And throughout that, the very strange thing was that U.S. journalists were actually working for a foreign power. They were really working for the Israeli government and the IDF.
You were talking about the Israeli government killing its own civilians on October 7th. Can you tell me what is the Hannibal Directive and how did that play out on October 7th?
Right. Well, here's the thing. The fact that Israel killed its own civilians was never corrected in the U.S. media. At the same time, right from the beginning, even Israeli media, and Israel's oldest newspaper, Haaretz, was reporting testimony from one of the hostages who saw the Israelis come in after 10 hours and just open fire. And all of the hostages that she was with, she said about a dozen people, and all of the, of course, Hamas fighters were killed. So she was the only one left. So they did that. They also, the Hannibal Directive basically says, we don't want anybody to take hostages, so that they will kill hostages instead of letting them be taken hostage. This was very clear. Also, Haaretz by December said that at the highest levels of the Israeli military, they called in the killing of hostages, and that was the Hannibal Directive. That is indisputed at this point. So you had pilots flying Apache helicopters. There were also just unloading all of the weaponry in their bellies off onto the rave area where the hostages with Hamas were fleeing to the border area. So then the Israelis would show very significant devastation of burning cars, of destroyed buildings. And there's no way that Hamas, with their weaponry, as many analysts have pointed out, could have done the type of damage that the Israelis identified that Hamas carried out. So that's what the Hannibal Directive was. And so that official narrative served a very important purpose for the press and for Israel to keep saying over and over again that Hamas had killed 1,200, mostly civilians, on October 7th.
You were talking about Haaretz, and it's remarkable that a lot of what they were reporting did not come into the U.S. media, mainstream media. What explains some of those differences? How is even Israeli reporting on Israeli atrocities not making it into the U.S. media? Well,
Haaretz and other official Israeli outlets, such as News 12, Channel 12, and some other, they had their spin on it, right? So the spin was they don't believe us if you don't tell all the truth. So there was some reasonable. However, a lot of content analysis, another kind of analysis of Israeli internal media, has shown that Israelis have been really indoctrinated for years. They're indoctrinated in school. Their media is mostly indoctrination. I think that what it showed was that at that time, I think Haaretz and a few of the outlets, were more open to opening up the media frame. And even right after October 7th, Haaretz had reported that Netanyahu was partly responsible for October 7th, and they identified what was going on the West Bank and some other very repressive actions of the Israeli occupation and the apartheid system to explain where October 7th came from. But October 7th was this encapsulated narrative where it's the origin story. Everything starts on October 7th. And then by ending any situation, any event, any massacre, the destruction of Al-Shifa Hospital, things like that, if you then follow it with Israel is doing all of this because of October 7th, when Hamas killed 1,200 Israeli, mostly civilians. So it's this perfect frame of their violence and our violence is always retaliatory. The other aspect of the coverage was that, by saying that it was, but also then Israeli, since this was defensive action, anything they did was justified, and they kept denying that they were attacking civilians. They were always attacking Hamas. Meanwhile, the Gaza Strip is destroyed, utterly destroyed, against every international law, rule of war. So everything that they did do when they said they were attacking Hamas was against international war. You can't kill civilians in war, according to international law.
You have a section where you talk about whose authority is just repeated as truth, or whose perspective, and then whose perspective is always kind of conditioned on, or basically just the Palestinian, of like the Hamas-run health ministry with their death numbers, versus like repeating words from the IDF as just like truth. Can you talk about that, of like who is seen as an expert and who's seen as an authority that is or isn't worthy of questioning?
Well, certainly the authorities at the UN were not at all interesting to the New York Times or CNN, some of the mainstream outlets. And when they were cited, they were distorted. And as you say, body counts. Body counts is a way to abstract the suffering of civilians in war. It has been for many years. But to do a body count is already dehumanizing. The Israeli killed on October 7th were presented in their whole humanity. You heard a lot of their biographies. You saw pictures of them alive. These were real people. Palestinian civilians killed were just numbers. And then they further dehumanized them by saying these numbers are according to the Gaza Health Ministry. And how did every single, media outlet come up with that, Meanwhile, the Gaza Health Ministry, or the Hamas-run health ministry, many people, Amnesty International, many of the UN higher-ups had also said these are very reliable numbers. We found them over the years to be very reliable. We know that it's reliable that 72,000 Palestinians were killed in Gaza. What that doesn't even touch, because that's recording each person. How many people are under the rubble? How many people are dying on a daily basis now because they're squashed more and more into less and less territory? They don't have medical, they don't have supplies, they don't have medications. They're wounded, they're traumatized. This remains a horror, even though we currently know that they weren't attacking Hamas,
It makes me think of the scrutiny that some numbers or cases are responded to, and sometimes the opposite of that. Like, there was one case that was published in the New York Times of, I think, a child who was starving, and then later turned out that the child had also had an immunodeficiency condition or something, and then the sort of argument against it was, well, they're already sick, so why they're not really starving, but.
Right,
yeah.
As an illustration that Gaza wasn't really starving. It was only these individual sick people.
Yeah.
That's, in UN standards, the way you talk about those people is these are on the front line of starvation. If these people start starving, you know that starvation is right there already.
Right.
It was also, of course, the famous story that, if you recall, aired on Barry Weiss's program, and that's what really endeared her to the life of David and Richard Ellison. And so that's a kind of pretty sophisticated propaganda that distorts. And what we found, and what several interesting studies found, was that Israel was very good at distorting the rules of war and to international journalists and to the Western press. So, for example, when they were going into Al-Shifa Hospital, they claimed that Hamas had a really extensive, almost like a pentagon underneath the hospital that was represented in this slick 3D video that showed them go down 3 stories in this totally invented fantasy that was nothing like the reality of the Gaza Strip. Then, so media would cover that and say, oh, and also Biden's name was really on this massacre at Al-Shifa, because they said, oh yes, no, this is corroborated. Hamas has these big places underneath Al-Shifa Hospital. And yet, after it was all over, the Washington Post actually, interestingly, did a pretty thorough investigation showing that the tunnels weren't connected to the hospital that they were talking about, that the rooms that they were talking about hadn't been occupied, that it was pretty much a complete fantasy. But what Israel did, and what the media, how they justified these attacks, is saying, yes, you're not supposed to attack hospitals, which is probably the worst taboo, to attack medical facilities and doctors and nurses and all kinds of health professionals in a war zone. It's just not done in modern warfare. The way they got away with it, they say, yes, but they lose their status as protected areas when the enemy goes in and takes them over. That's not true. Even if Hamas had a pentagon underneath there, Israel would still have been obliged to protect the doctors and nurses and patients that were in that hospital and not destroy that hospital. The New York Times, for example, was directed by its editorial staff, journalists at the Times, not to use any of the language of humanitarian principles or humanitarian war.
Can you talk about sexual violence and how accusations of rape were kind of spread through the media and other instances of rape are not as considered?
Right. There's a whole chapter in the book on the infamous New York Times rape story. Right. There's so many things wrong with that. I don't really have time to detail it. But the fact is that there was no credible eyewitness testimony. There was no person involved in being raped that testified. As what a military official spokesperson for the IDF told the New York Times, we have zero forensic evidence, as if that was a good thing. He's saying, we have zero. There was no visual documentation of anything. As it turns out, the primary quote-unquote first responders, these Zaka volunteers, they were tied to Netanyahu's public relations wing of his government, and they had direct contact with Netanyahu. They're also the ones who distributed the whole false beheaded baby story. There were 40 beheaded baby story. This is an old saw in war propaganda that goes back to World War I, the slaughter of innocents that the Germans did, supposedly. There was one infant killed on October 7th, and that was published within a month. So there was no way that Biden could have really looked at pictures of beheaded babies like Netanyahu told him to, and all of that stuff. So anyway, the rape story, the same people who verified the rape story were Zaka members who did the beheaded baby stories. They brought the rape story back into the frame at the end of December 2023, just as the South Africa genocide case was being presented toward the International Criminal Court. There's all kinds of reasons that story, it just had propaganda all over. It wasn't a case of journalism. It was a case of trauma porn, and one of the worst kind of unverified atrocities that's ever been in print. It was graphic, and the main character, this poor woman, whose family was very manipulated by the New York Times, right away said, our daughter wasn't raped. That was a made-up, invented story. And they charged the New York Times. They said, they lied to us.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was the impact of that story getting spread, through all of the U.S. and the West?
By the Democratic National Convention, so that was mid-August 2024, the story had been debunked so thoroughly by that time that Kamala Harris said on the floor of the Democratic Convention that Hamas had weaponized rape and there was mass rape on October 7th. So recently we have the Times publishing a piece by Nicholas Kristof where he documents and provides testimony of some pretty graphic stuff too, of how the Israelis have tortured and beaten and sexually traumatized and raped Palestinian prisoners based on information that is being documented for years and from multiple human rights organizations. The Times didn't even have the decency, shall we say, to balance its rape story with any of these details of what Palestinians, how they were being treated behind the walls of Israeli prisons. So now when Kristof comes out with it just a couple of weeks ago with this detail, what do? They balance it the very next day with yet another investigation from the Israelis, a 2-year investigation that's a big amassment of all this visual footage. They've got 10,000 images and videotapes, all these things, except for they can't show them to us, because that would be bad for the families. The Israelis are now reporting, and this has become a bigger story, where Israelis are now reporting that the IDF took their footage of their families on October 7th and what happened to them, and they won't give them back. Wow. So they've now basically confiscated all of the evidence of October 7th, and they won't let anybody see it.
Wow. I've been interested in how Palestine has become an issue in universities, and I was speaking to a researcher who had said that the right for many decades had been trying to get more influence in universities in bluer states. And until October 7th, they hadn't really been able to do that. But October 7th provided this opening for them to kind of work their way into universities. What is it about Palestine that creates these openings for conservatives to kind of come into traditionally more progressive spaces? Why is it Palestine?
There's always been this Palestine exception, and there's a really good film called The Palestine Exception, to anything, freedom of speech, charges of war crimes. And I think that has to do with the way in which our public sphere and our ability to speak truthfully, to speak what we feel, to express our opinions, has been under attack by the Israeli lobby now for years, literally years. And I think we can attribute that to the Israeli lobby. Honest reporting, I talk about it in the book, where they openly attack journalists, Palestinian journalists, so much so, and the Canary Mission as well, that a photographer, a Palestinian photographer, was fired at the New York Times. Meanwhile, the New York Times is a very kind of Israeli-centered bureau in Jerusalem, where most of the bureau chiefs have been very pro-Israel. But that's another story. Back to October 7th, and then the Palestinian, and the idea that we'll shut down education if we start to talk about and be able to talk about what's going on and how Israel has actually been treating. It's an occupation, it's an apartheid system. All of this was determined and written about and identified well before October 7th. But it shows you the effectiveness of the Israeli narrative, the pro-Israeli narrative that was set in place well before October 7th. And the universities, I mean, I just was watching an online videotape of Edward Said, and he's quoted as saying, you know, in the classroom is like a place that's so expressive where we can talk about things and have a dialogue among ourselves. It's almost a utopian area for freedom of speech. And I used to tell my students when I was a prof at Fordham that this is the final place where we can actually talk. The way we authentically want to and express ourselves within a community is in this space and in this classroom. So, of course, that was the last one that they really wanted to take out. And now, if you're a professor at Columbia, that's why Rashid Khalidi, who wrote the introduction, and he wrote in The Guardian, he can't even teach his class anymore at Columbia, because even to do Middle East history, he would have to talk about the laws that were passed in Israel that took away Palestinian rights in the country, even for Palestinian citizens there. So even that you can't say. So this idea on the surface that if you criticize the government of Israel, which so richly deserves to be criticized, that you're anti-Semitic, has been a fiction. And ever since October 7th, we know it's a fiction. And yet, because the media continue to promote it, and now Trump has taken out universities, and they too, I must say, the word complicit can be used for them. They're finding success there. And I'm just hoping that that can be reversed sometime soon.
You mentioned anti-Semitism, which since October 7th has just become this word that has been thrown around a lot. And like after Nicholas Kristof's article, the comments were saying that not only is this not true, but this is a form of blood libel against Israelis and then by extension Jews. Can you talk about this anti-Semitism thing and how it has really just blown up in the last few years as any criticism of Israel is by extension seen as a form of anti-Semitism?
Well, I think it's very dangerous for the Jewish community and Jewish people already. And they, you know, JVP and Jewish organizers that have been right on the cutting edge of some of the protests, certainly in New York City, understood this right from the beginning, that if you're not going to allow us to criticize the Israeli government, then where does that leave us? It says that all Jews are pro-genocide. When global publics, over their handheld devices, saw what was going on in Gaza, they saw how people were suffering. They could compare it to what they were seeing on their establishment media. But they had these brave Palestinian journalists who were willing to document this and give their lives to do so. These people were incredible. So they know what's going on. It's not like we don't know anymore what happened in Gaza and what is still happening, even though they don't report on it anymore. That's been their solution. It's very dangerous to say that global Jewish communities are pro the state of Israel, right? That's going to spread global anti-Semitism, and we know that, right? So what I find interesting is after the flotilla, where they were kidnapped in international waters, and then horribly treated on these different boats, just crammed into containers, beaten. So many of them have broken bones, broken collarbones, broken ribs, broken arms. And they were also sexually assaulted and raped. They were stripped down. This type of humiliation, which now we know Palestinians have suffered all this time doing the same. But when we saw it through the eyes of Western victims, that was interesting and that was different. And all of a sudden, that was a little bit difficult to ignore. So what did the Israeli lobbyists do? What media frame have they come up with? Ben-Gvir. So since he put his image up, right, attacking those flotilla members, they actually played on anti-Semitism themselves. Ben-Gvir shown with his tongue out. It's a classic anti-Jewish stereotype. And they're saying, this isn't Israel, this is now Ben-Gvir. So what are we supposed to make of that, too? So there's really no way to justify the genocide. They're holding on by a thread. The global status of Israel and Israel's status in the United States is basically tanked. So we know what they're doing now. It has nothing to do with anti-Semitism.
Thinking of whose perspectives are privileged or seen as more legitimate throughout all of this, Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been continuously discredited and killed and attacked. Can you talk about how the West has viewed Palestinian journalists who are documenting their own genocide through all of this?
Well, they didn't view them as real journalists, I guess, because they didn't find solidarity in the purpose of journalism, which was to tell the truth and on the ground. And, you know, historically, U.S. media and network particularly, and the papers of record, they wanted to be on the ground in places. Their ability to access the theater of operation defined for them their journalism. They were there to simply witness what was going to happen between two belligerent sides. And that's always how they defined their ability to bring the truth to the American public. They went along with Israel blocking everybody from going into the Gaza Strip. No Western media was allowed to go into the Gaza Strip unless they embedded, which of course was an American practice that happened during the first Gulf War, where the first Gulf War was like a reality show where the journalists were looking over the shoulders. I asked one journalist, "Are you going to be able to report on somebody who gets killed in the theater of operation?" And they go, "No, we're really telling the U.S. side of the story." That's how they did it. So that's what happens. Also in Gaza now, if NBC or CBS goes in with the troops, they're embedded and all of their script is censored by the military because that's what you give up. I think also because they were very dedicated to their pro-Israeli frame, they begin to look bad if they have these alternative sources of media contradicting what they're saying. They don't like that. And they wanted to kind of pretty much hide that Israel was blocking them from the Gaza Strip. They didn't report on the deaths. They didn't report on the value of the First Amendment, that the Palestinian journalists there were basically also, you know, reporting the first draft of history. And that's what journalism is called. It's the first draft of history. And I see that book as an early draft of the documentation of the history of media coverage. I'm sure there's more and more to be said. But so that's what I think. It was just a complete abandonment of Palestinian journalists.
Yeah, I remember, still, but at the time especially, there was this moment where all the Western mainstream media was complaining about not being able to access Gaza to report. The view was that there weren't any journalists in Gaza, but there were Palestinian journalists reporting there from the beginning.
Right. And their footage went out over international sites. There's Turkish international media. There's Al Jazeera, of course.
Yeah. Bombing has resumed in Gaza. Now we have the U.S. involved in Lebanon and Iran, and I'm wondering if you notice anything different in how this kind of current moment of war is being portrayed in the media versus kind of the peak of the genocide a year or so ago.
There has been some very good reporting by the BBC and other international journalists in Lebanon that has countered the frame, but in the New York Times and in establishment media, basically they just stopped covering Gaza. So we don't hear anything that's happening mostly in Gaza right now because there's no it's going to be very difficult to justify what they're doing. They're just taking it over, and they're exterminating the Palestinians, and they're engaging in ethnic cleansing, and there's no other way to talk about it. In Lebanon, all they really did was mirror what they did in Gaza. And their reporting is the same. They're calling it a buffer zone, right? So below the river in southern Lebanon, that's a buffer zone. No, they're actually destroying villages. They're destroying everything, sites, hospitals, just like they did in Gaza. Yet the media don't portray it like that. They portray it against Hezbollah. So they've simply substituted Hezbollah for Hamas. And they're doing exactly the same thing. They're just, the words are slightly different. Buffer zone, right? Hezbollah's stories is even more dramatic than Hamas's. Hezbollah came together in 1982 as a consequence of Israel attacking Lebanon. They were openly resistance fighters. They also aren't going to report much about Hezbollah has actually used its drones. They've done some damage to the IDF, and I don't think we see that on establishment media.
Thank you so much, Robin. It's a really incredible compendium and archive of what the last 3 years and beyond have been. So we appreciate your work, and thanks for speaking to me.
Thanks for taking the time, Anna. Appreciate it.